welcome. Welcome to the lecture series. Very pleased tonight to introduce Gary Bates, a partner in Space Group from Oslo, Norway. One of the things that I am interested in, was interested in coming here to USC and being here at USC is to think about where practice emerged really for the legacy of this school around questions of innovation. So practice, architectural practice and innovation were really hand in hand as I see it. And I think that's a very important legacy in history. And I think we need to think about how to shape a way of thinking about architectural practice that's fresh and new, but also provides a feedback loop into how we think about pedagogy and teaching. I can't really think of a better young, fairly young practitioner working today who is addressing these issues of practice, architectural practice in the 21st century, than Gary Bates. And I should say I first met Gary on a review at Cornell for a mutual friend, Kunle Adeyemi, an architect from Africa. And I listened intently, as I do on reviews, not just talking myself. I listened intently to Gary's comments during that jury, not really knowing anything about him. This was many years ago. And it is Norway where he's practicing, so I didn't feel that guilty about my ignorance, but then when I started looking at the work, I felt very guilty that I did not know the tremendous amount of work and what he's doing in practice. As I began to research his work and learn more about his practice and how it was formed, I was interested to learn more, and I did. We saw each other in Venice a couple of years ago and again at Michigan, where I invited him to speak. And what became apparent is that he is a deep thinker, a passionate designer, a humble yet leading voice on what a 21st century architecture and urban design practice can be. He is in Norway, but he is a native of Delaware and has spent most of his career in Norway. He was educated at Virginia Tech, graduating in 1990. He played basketball in high school, not college, right? Okay. Interesting fact. But he also worked in the U.S., but then worked a lot in Europe. He's completed successful projects in Europe, Asia, and the U.S., but he really began his collaboration with big architecture, big thinking at the office of Rem Koolhaas and Office of Metropolitan Architecture in 1992, where he became a director, and from 1995 to 1998, a principal in charge of the Asian desk for OMA. He worked with and later hired, I believe, other alums from OMA's office, Bjork Ingels, among many, and it's a very interesting and established group that have gone on to have prolific practices of their own, and Gary's one of those alumnus. He founded Space Group in Oslo with Gro Bonesmo in 1999. A designer and architect, Gary cultivates a thorough research as an integral part of the design process, and the office quickly made its mark with projects such as Prostneset Ferry Terminal in Tromsø, Vestbanen in Tromsø, is that the right pronunciation? Yeah. Among other projects, Vestbanen National Library, Philippe Stad Master Plan, and the conceptual work for the Meeting Room of the Future. This research culminated in 2008 with the curation of the Oslo Architecture Triennial under the title The Culture of Risk. His firm also was curator of the Nordic Pavilion at the 14th International Architecture Exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2014. He's currently involved in Space Group projects worldwide, from Côte d'Ivoire to Russia, Louisville, Kentucky, New York, and Azerbaijan. And he's been a visiting teacher, lecturer and critic at the University of Texas, University of Kentucky, the Oslo School of Architecture, Syracuse, the Berlage Institute in the Netherlands, and many others. As part of his selection for a master plan project in the city of Louisville, Michael Speaks now dean at Syracuse University, but then at the time of these comments, dean of the University of Kentucky College of Design, and the chairman of the selection committee of the master plan project in the city of Louisville, said the following, quote, Gary Bates sets himself apart from the field of world-class finalists interviewed by the committee with a powerful presentation that demonstrated not only his knowledge of Lexington and the region, but also the innovative approach his office, Space Group, takes to architecture and urban design. The scale and scope of projects that Gary has been directly involved in is quite a long list. But more importantly, as I believe he will share this evening, his thoughts and actions on how to take the architect-client, architect-service provider condition and mentality and turn that really upside down. This should be very instructive to us all as we rethink, and we're forced to rethink the conventional forms of practice in a changing world. So please join me in welcoming Gary Bates to USC.
Well, it's difficult to come up here after that introduction, but I appreciate it immensely. It's been a long time since I was in Los Angeles, and it's kind of amazing for me to be here, so I regret a bit this day has come because I'm leaving already tomorrow. There are a lot of things that have happened in both the profession and also my practice specifically, and in the last few years, let's say, we've started to kind of reimagine and rethink our roles. So tonight, I mean, there are times where I talk about architecture, and when I do go into the radical, say, depths of architecture, which is we're building buildings. In some ways, fewer and fewer buildings, ironically enough, but we've been for the last 5 years starting to kind of change our profession, change the way that we are working, change the way that we're approaching clients, change the way that we're getting involved into projects, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So the lecture is kind of twofold. I'm not going to show particularly beautiful, illustrative Iwan Bond photographs of amazing architecture, although that's what's generally expected of us. I will show where we were very briefly, and then I want to talk about where I think we're going, and more so where we're going, but where I think the profession can go with a kind of shift in the attitude, taking the education that we have and using it differently. I'm currently working on a book, and that's where this title comes from. That's the title of the book, not the cover of the book, which hasn't been designed yet, but the title of the book called Spaceman, which could be interpreted as a manifesto, could be interpreted as a manual. I'm going to use it in the form of a manual. It's not a book about architecture, but it is an architectural book. The introductory text in the book is entitled The Death of Architecture, but Not the Architect. So the book was an impetus, and that was where this change for us, the change for me, started. I'm going to go through a series of projects now and tell you a little bit about where let's say, where we've been to try to create a kind of, let's say, to try to create and understand the paradigm of where our practice tried to position itself and where we see the change happening. Interestingly enough, in 19 years now of practicing, our company's done 31 competitions, 32, maybe 33. We've won 14 of them. So we've won almost 50% of the competitions. We've lost 17. We've built 3. So of 30 competitions and 14 or 15 wins, we've built 3 of them. Of those 31 competitions, in those 31 competitions, we've invested $7 million US. Of those $7 million US, we've made, I think, approximately somewhere in the order of about $1 million. Of those $1 million we've made, so we have a total investment in our architectural work that's roughly $5.5 to $6 million US. That's what we've calculated. We just sit down. We like to run numbers in our office to understand what investment have we put back into the practice, and what more so to look at what we've put in versus what we've gotten out. I have this idea in our office, which is called, I don't know if I did that or someone else did that. To tell you a little bit about any office, it's going to get increasingly bright here now. We have this number at the office. We have this number at the office which we call 60/40. 60/40 relates to, let's say, the amount of projects that and hours that we work that have to be billed versus in order to stay kind of operative and sustainable. I'm not going to talk about any of these projects, but I'll flip through them. The 40% is actually the interesting number, because the 40% is the number that where we're not actually making money, but it's actually usually the number where the research and the intelligence and the experiments happen. And as we don't do many competitions, we do roughly 1, sometimes 2 a year. That 40% is what we are investing into the expansion of the ideas of the office. In Norway, we have this incredibly robust, this is Norway, it's incredibly beautiful. This is the Viking Museum. There are beautiful Viking ships inside, amazing structures. I would advise you all to check it out if you go to Oslo. The robustness of the economy in Norway also comes at its detriment. Yeah, it's an incredibly rich country, so it's a little bit strange for me, coming from an entirely different background, being in this country where it's an incredibly flat structure. That flatness is an amazing opportunity. By flatness, I mean I can go and walk into any situation, approach kind of anyone, and you don't have the layers of hierarchy that you have in other cultures. It gives you the ability to do person-to-person business in a way that is unique, I think, really in Scandinavia. At the same time, in that situation, there's an incredible aversity to competition. There's an incredible aversity to new ideas. That flatness is kind of predicated on the fact that everything should be fairly controlled, fairly understandable. And more, let's say, we're like kind of almost asked to deliver standard solutions. In my view, architects are kind of, and this is what the lecture is really going to talk about, and not these projects, which are kind of beautiful, and I'm not telling you what they are because it doesn't really matter what they are. But they are projects for my office. But I think we're incredibly underused as architects. I think our ability to distill, mobilize, structure the interfaces in social space is immense, yet continues to be marginalized. The value added is grossly underestimated of what we can bring to the table. Our greatest capital is the capital of our ideas. Our primary motivation in competitions for my office is not to build, and it's not a form of acquisition. It's a very polemical situation. Competitions are mechanisms we use to grow, to reinvent ourselves. Without them, I would argue that we stagnate. The beauty of competition is that it's the most naked form of performance you could want. It's a platform where we spend a ridiculous amount of resources and time to do exactly what we want to do. And it's at that point that we actually start to find glimpses and moments of evolution in our practice. Without evolution, our profession becomes, in many ways, completely banal. These are some of the projects that we've been involved in. This is a project together with OMA for the new library and National Museum. This is a model of that project. This is in Riga, an island in the middle of the... was not the tower, by the way. The project was invisible. Here in Oslo, right by the train station, which we're currently developing and I'll talk about. In the north of the country, in Sweden, in Finland, the Rupp Arena, I wasn't aware, I didn't calculate the time difference, so actually this is supposed to be live, but in fact all these people you see here are sleeping now. Parallel with the writing of Spaceman, I started to deconstruct the office. Taking the visions of the office, we started to break down the practice, creating separate companies, the first of those separate companies being a company called Deep. So my partner and I started a company called Deep. Deep was all of the space of collaboration that we didn't directly impact. We saw an opportunity to use our research and analysis and portfolio in connecting investment capital to investors and to other investors and to developers. We saw ways that through our processes to connect to political structures and what we call political power structures, which each city has, and ultimately building better business cases for our clients. We didn't start with the clients, and we didn't charge any fees. We approached each task independently, and we found contractual models and models for remuneration that were commensurate with the value that we were actually adding to the project. Then we look at all of our small projects. So that was the first company, Deep. Then we started to look at all of our small projects. So Deep, in a way, started to, there is this, if you guys know Deloitte & Touche, they do kind of these amazing due diligence kind of reports and tell you, yes, there are so many hotel rooms, the city is kind of lacking, you, sir, should build a new hotel. But with that, and then the client comes in and says, okay, yeah, we thought so, we're going to build a new hotel, and then they start looking for a site and they kind of move on. We wanted to change that process, and so what Deep is actually looking at is everything prior to hiring an architect. So everything that we're talking about in the last now 2 years is how we can kind of deconstruct our practice, and in order to, by deconstructing it, in order to reassemble it and look at how each one of these qualities and characteristics that we have, how we can reassemble them and put together a new type of practice. So Deep started to look at the due diligence part and saying, we can do due diligence, and we've always done it. We've just never kind of packaged it that way. And we took the due diligence, and we took our kind of research, and then we started looking at business cases, which we were also developing, and we started to package and understand how we could help our clients in their business cases. Because ultimately, if we couldn't speak their language, then we were not ultimately helping them and adding value to their process. And at the same time, all of the social values that we want to impart meant that we had to go through the political structures in order to make them possible. So we started to build in that field, which is prior to drawing a line and making architecture. And that's what Deep does. On the other hand, we had a gazillion small projects where people call us, yeah, we need a new stair on our house. Yeah, we need a new loft. Yes, we need a new building on the back. And we found so kind of problematic with that and was that essentially all those people who are kind of, they're coming to us and they've tried to piece together an architectural process, not really understanding what applications do we need? How do we extend our house? How do we build a new garage? And we thought, well, most of the time we do it because we know the person. We say, sure, we're going to help you. It's an enormous amount of work. It's completely unaffordable. Our hourly rates are too high. They just want to do some simple extension of their house. But to go through it is an enormous laborious, kind of a laborious process, which we thought, this is completely stupid. So either then they go and they can hire a kind of, like one of you guys just out of school who is willing to work basically for free and do an immense amount of work to figure out all the legalities of doing it, which also I'm not recommending. A lot of people do that. And so instead what we started to do was, or what we thought we would do, is now we've created a digital platform to make a kind of hyper-rational approach where any client can engage this platform, get the information they need, understand the process, and help them build a process using a selected group of architects, and ultimately creating less work for ourselves. So giving away the work we do to kind of optimize it and make it intelligible for any person to use. So all of those projects we start to kind of reorganize. If you guys know this image, kind of ironically from May 1968, this is Cedric Price. What I want to talk about today, so if all those pictures and images and things was where our practice was, and now I start to talk about, and those are just 3 of the companies we're doing. There are more companies that we're looking at as well. Where we're starting to, the lecture and what I want to talk about is kind of instructions to how to use buildings, instructions on how to use, and instructions on how to use the city, instructions on how to use the landscape, and taking all of these parts and putting them back together into what is ultimately the Spaceman and the Space Manual. The visionaries of the 60s saw it coming. Cedric Price looked at digital platforms for mobility, for knowledge sharing, the democratization of resources. Market economy became challenged by sharing economy, by circular economy, driven by the environmental consciousness that we all have. And all of a sudden, we start to look at new relationships in the city as a result of that. City morphologies differ from user to user, generating different experiences. As architects, we've largely focused on enclosures and programming. As landscape architects, we focused on voids. As urbanists, on sorting and structuring and grids and mobility. As interior architects, on communications and brand. When we combine these, we have a space manual for the composite urban territory called the city. So these instructions about, now the first project I'm going to look at, this is a ferry terminal, a project, a competition that we won in 2003, 15 years ago. It's finished construction in 2 or 3 months from now. It took us 15 years from competition until now, an enormous investment, an enormous amount of time. A beautiful location on the waterfront. That competition at that time, to kind of put it in the context, was Zaha Hadid, MVRDV, and foreign office architects, and one local firm, and ourselves. Everyone made beautiful kind of gigantic mastodons of architecture, and we took a slightly different approach. And that approach, for me, with this project, and it's kind of a very simple story, I was in the city. It was October, November, around 30, 32 degrees, no snow yet. I saw a couple of people cross the street, a man and a woman cross the street, met another couple in the middle of the street. The woman was carrying a child. Cars were driving on either side of them while they were talking in the middle of the street. The woman was breastfeeding at the same time. And I understood that in Scandinavia, and especially here in the north, their relationship to space and public space and territorialization was entirely different than anything I knew from New York or from Philadelphia or from Los Angeles, let's say. And suddenly we started to look at, more than we were looking at the buildings, we started to look at how the definition of space, how this interstitial space, how this idea of territorialization, and what this project actually meant for the city, before we started looking at what it meant for the clients. An incredibly beautiful location. This is standing on the quay, looking out over the waterfront. So we devised a project which was divided into, let's say we took their program, which is essentially a bus terminal, a ferry terminal, and a speedboat terminal. Speedboats are connecting people to all the islands that you see in the distance there, and made a terminal then where we turned the building kind of inside out, created enormous public space, an enormous outdoor space, which seems kind of strange to do in the middle of the polar circle, but actually incredibly important in terms of the occupation of this building. Lifted the ground plane on top of the building so that all the cargo areas and things are concealed underneath the building, and then created these individual buildings which maximize their interface with the city, remaining a 2-story building, incredibly small, incredibly compact, and incredibly spacious. So this is the view from the street, and one of the main views that we wanted to protect, with the access through the building, a drive up, turn around, drive down, terminal building on the right side, offices and commercial spaces on the left side on the ground plane. As I said, I apologize for the lack of beauty in the photographs. I hope that you can find another kind of beauty, which I'm trying to discuss today. Then we're considering to invite Iwan to come up, but I'm not sure if we'll do it yet or not. And I actually prefer these. I think these are all taken with my telephone. And most of the lecture today is taken by my telephone, I believe. Entrance on the ground floor and the square on this side, where you see that wooden handrail. Sliding behind that wall is the access to bicycle parking, a large bicycle parking garage, entrance into the terminal building. In the background there is the headquarters of the harbor authorities. You see that gold facade will become a theme that will come back, how we create a space that is, so the building, there's a beautiful condition in Norway which is called a gård. A gård is, let's say, a collection of buildings, and generally, which says something also about the kind of social ideology in Norway, is that you create this group of buildings where they're incredibly modest, almost nondescript on the outside, and when you come into the center of the buildings, the ornament and detailing is kind of introverted and say, enjoyed by the people who are actually staying in this complex or in this collection of buildings. And in a certain way with that public space, essentially with an extremely low budget, looking at both how to understand the detailing, the tactility, and creating within these spaces kind of interiority in the space, in the public space. So I'm going to take you for a walk around the building. Here we are standing in the city. The city is behind us. The famous church is just, and wooden church is just behind me. And some of the materiality, this is a concrete formwork that you see here, and aluminum. The entry, small shift in the facade. In each of these small shifts, you'll see the frames on the outside of the glass towards the square, creating a texture and an opacity as you look towards the water, and the square and the views towards the south. Interior on the above. This black line runs around the entire building and becomes the lifted landscape in which these different buildings are standing on and relating to. Here we're on the side where the speedboats arrive, and the large door there is where the passengers will enter from the speedboats. The other doors you see there will be for cargo and storage. This is where the buses come out, and again, you'll see how that concrete prefabricated facade, incredibly, let's say, straightforward, how it turns into the frames of the glass. This is where the buses are coming out, so we're looking to the left into the bus area for 16 buses. So where the concrete and the wooden, there's a kind of vertical wooden slats that are creating let's say, an acoustic, kind of acoustic wall inside the bus terminal. Under the cantilever of the terminal above, the ferry terminal above. This is the bridge. I have to confess that I was, at the time of my education, a fan of Mr. John Haydock. So we, with neither the elegance or proportions of what he was able to achieve, but let's say some of the movement that we were fascinated by. That's the connection from the boats. So that building there allows us to connect to the boats. As the passengers come off, escalators and stairs that go up and connect back to the building. Here we are standing underneath it, looking up the connection piece that's hovering above, where all of on the ground floor, where you have all of the forklifts and things that are moving the cargo. These ships, these cruise ships that move up and down the Norwegian coast, are actually used as well to transport goods and materials, because there's no train service, very limited road service. Again, a similar detail that you saw on the square on the ground. Now we're on the square above. The gold facade on the right is kind of reappearing. The gold facade on the left. So those three gold facades create this kind of courtyard, which was the tune effect, or the god that I was describing before. Here under the cantilever of the roof, material inside, outside of the roof. So the corrugation of the roof, the gold facade, and then the black mullions, which are silver mullions on the ground floor, and the continuation of the black mullions on the second floor. Moving inside the building, black polished concrete floors. There's a beautiful book which I could recommend for you that was instrumental. I was reading it for the second time when I was doing this building. It's called In Praise of Shadows, if you guys know it, written in 1930, 1934. Fantastic book that talks a lot about the differences in things like light and shadow related to Japanese culture versus, let's say, versus Western culture. And so there are the use of the materials, the use of wood in the building, the use of this kind of muted materials. People are asking me, okay, the black floors, well, the virtue of the black polished or the black concrete floors, which are fairly matte, so they're not reflecting the light. And as you look out of the building into the water is also appearing black, right? So there's a kind of continuation inside, outside, from the floor of the terminal to the outside. Small detail, standing in the bus terminal as we're moving kind of around the building and looking up. a kind of retraction of the square, letting daylight into the bus terminal. No one could understand why that was so important for us to bring daylight into the bus terminal. And looking back up, you see the gold facade from the office building, which is stepping back. That stepping back is kind of incredibly important, and I can show you why, because now I'm going to go like back, and that stepping back creates this condition that you see that kind of opens the building to the city here, in this space here. I mean, the definition not just of the space on the ground floor in the plan, but the definition of how the building how you experience the building in section and spatially and light-wise. Light is incredibly important there, particularly because of the lack of light. Moving still around the building, now we're on the north side, moving up underneath this cantilever that you see here. We're standing underneath that spot and going up to the square. So we just arrived from behind that building, and now we're standing on the second square. The offices are the headquarters of the terminal building, here using an aluminum facade, which is in this case with the intention of reflecting the light, but with a coating that kind of makes it more matte. The same material in between the windows, the black frames with a black Veltec facade, kind of creating a continuous strip around the entire building as the windows appear black. Here you see the gold facade with the extroverted mullions standing on the square, which folds down and meets the road as that space opens up. Moving inside, the lights create a kind of second ceiling, incredibly so. The cheapest possible ceiling you can have, exposed ductwork, everything is painted to match its kind of surroundings, and the lighting creates a second kind of ceiling, giving priority. Two boxes determine more or less the entire interior space, with a number of commercial then facilities in there. Here, the kind of tourist office on the right side. Moving through the building. So when we came in, now we have the speedboats on our left side. I said you went into that door. When you come into that door and you move up the stair, you emerge here into the main space. The truss that you see there, and that golden truss, refers back to the gold color that you saw in the key. That color comes back in the building, and the steel, or the key is coming back in the building, and the steel used inside the building. And then that is, let's say, so that is a waiting area for passengers with an incredible view. Moving back outside the building, here you see where the buses are coming out, looking at the south and west facades of the building. Okay. It'll be finished in 2 months. It's a great place for polar exploration if you guys are in the area. I recommend it highly to take a visit there. That project hasn't been seen, and I haven't talked about it for a long time. The Central Station project in Oslo, again, putting it into a kind of time perspective, we won the competition in 2008. So the first one we won in 2003. We worked on it for 15 years. Finished completion. This was 2008. Now it's soon 10 years after we won the competition. Organizing public as functions of a kind of spatial network, managing the politics of space and the social capital within that space. Delaminating the complexity of infrastructure and commercial sprawl while managing the phasing of this building, which should maintain the flow of 50 million passengers a year and kind of increasing with every year. We were confronted, all of you probably know this kind of beautiful white iceberg called the Oslo Opera. The station is a less recognizable project. What you generally find in stations and like airports and the places that you travel is that as these buildings kind of grow and sprawl in every direction, they have no chance in kind of redefining themselves, so they only can kind of move outwards. And stations become, on top of that, there's an ideology in stations that they're becoming increasing like shopping malls and shopping centers. We approach this project through a demolition of a large part of the station. And that demolition was premised on the idea that the majority of people that will be moving through that station are no longer coming from the west, and the west was the rich part of the city, but they would be coming from the north and moving towards the south. And so that shift in axis in that project was incredibly important to understand a rereading of that project. And then we made that cut and we shifted it and moved from north to south. What we essentially created was a public space versus more station. So this is the original kind of station and how it grew. The station looked like that on the top left, incredibly beautiful. You walked into a building and you were standing next to the tracks and you went onto the tracks. They slowly started building around the station. So the station started on the top left and ended here on the bottom right as a kind of incredible amalgamation of unrecognizable architecture kind of growing wider and wider. This is the original station, beautiful. The trains pulled directly into the building. You walked in, the building is still there, but almost unrecognizable as it's become surrounded. So you get this incredible, let's say, instead of just going from the building, going out into the city, and the city and the building having this, say, close connection, what we then try to do is to return that kind of condition, which you see here. This is the station on the left. This is the station that we kind of designed. Before there was any architecture, we kind of designed how we actually wanted the public to give instructions on how to use the city. And one of those instructions were that we wanted to make a public space, and that public space would be 300 meters long, and that 300-meter long public space, everything around it could be, continue to be commercial, grab and go, hot dog, soda shops, whatever, but you would create this boulevard, and that boulevard then would give you access to the rest of the complex. But what it would also do is it would give you proximity to the trains and where you wanted to be, and that proximity was incredibly, for us, important, because essentially we wanted to go back to that scenario on the left side, which you came into a building, you went into the building, you went into the train. Here, in this case, by cutting through that fabric, we create a boulevard that allows us to go directly to the trains without this, without being forced to consume. These are the numbers. This is the shift that no one recognized, which we kind of proved in our case for that project. This is the labyrinth of circulation that happens today and all of the connections that are happening underground, above ground, around the station. And this is how the station looks today, kind of fantastic, beautiful train station that you cannot find. These are images that you've probably seen before, not specifically this station, but how a train station more often than not looks. Okay. So we wanted to look at it differently. We organized all the circulation. We looked at where we could bring the structure down while maintaining 100% operation of the trains, which in itself was a kind of difficult operation. Then we looked at how we could create this boulevard, navigating from 0 to +5 to +9, because there's a tunnel that goes under the station. We create that, as you see, in the north-south axis in the image here. We create a tree structure that allows us to bridge and allows us to parametrically model where every column is landing, because there's only a given number of points where we can land because of the foundations and maintaining the operation of the trains as they are. And we end up with a project that looks like that. A high-rise to the right, a park on the roof, a 300-meter long kind of station standing on this tree structure, and a new building delaminated from the old building on the left side there. So that's what we created, with an idea that the station can look like this, giving that space back to the city. This is the section through the entire building. There you see the tunnel, the bridging, the landing points of the structure. And we made a business case to our clients saying that by doing so, the office space, and because obviously now they're looking at their bottom line. Our project, of all the projects that submitted for this competition, that we won was the smallest project, but by far had the greatest yield. So we were able to kind of achieve our agenda, give them a business case that was kind of economically feasible, and now we've been fighting with the city for the last 10 years, which soon is hopefully coming to an end. In addition, there's a tower. The tower has one kind of incredibly important idea, also for the city. Karl Johan is the main kind of thoroughfare in the city, which leads from the castle on the far left down to the train station. And in the distance, you have a small mountain, which is incredibly important for the sight lines of the city and understanding the reading of the landscape in the city, which in Norway is incredibly important. So that view line was protected. So the tower is split, and it looks like this. A conference center, the green box that's elevated, commercial space below. And as I said, we didn't get rid of commercial space, we just condensed the commercial space. We created specific destinations of commercial, all connected to the spine, and the spine was a void. So we basically designed this void that then allows us to intersect with all the existing structures that were already there, plus giving them 80,000, or let's say 800,000 square feet of new office, commercial, hotel square feet. It's 80,000 square meters, so roughly 800,000 square feet. 2 towers. With the entry to the hotel on the ground floor, an escalator that brings you onto the roof, and the park on top with views to the fjord. So move through the building, through the structure. There you see the new building, which is retracted from the existing building as it was before, creating a public space. The square, we're walking now with our backs towards the opera and towards the waterfront. The towers on the right-hand side, the escalators going up to the roof. All right, before we get ill. So, if those, let's say the first 2 projects are, for me, starting to talk about instructions on how to use the city, instructions on how to rethink infrastructure. The next framework for us is really important, is instructions, and the next 2 projects are instructions on how to use existing building mass. In principle, there was a beautiful exhibition, the Dutch Pavilion at Venice, where they essentially built a foam model of all of the empty or partly empty buildings in the entire country. And the conclusion of their analysis and calculations were that they actually, regardless of the growth, would never need to build another building for 25 years to take the current growth curve of the country if they were actually able to repurpose all the architecture that they already had. Now, I'm convinced, whether you like it or not, that probably the majority of you will be working within existing building mass, and there's an immense amount of it that needs to be rethought and needs to be kind of repurposed and has an incredible amount of potential if we understand it, understand programming, and understand the, let's say, of how to treat the kind of historical conditions that each of these edifices represent. This is a project which was completed in 2013, a cultural district that we were responsible for. What we're looking at was showing how we would reimagine the city from within, working within these structures. We designed essentially the entire neighborhood. You see the factory, it's an old textile factory there. The telephone company has all of their technology in that tower. There's a river that runs around the building, which you just see to the left side of the circle there with the small bridge. It kind of wraps around the building. And that factory had been out of use for quite many years. A young guy bought it, didn't know what to do with it, approached us, and came to us at a point where we actually could help him determine how to use the building and what the potential of the building was, how to make sure the building was future-proof. So the essential use of the building, it's a media house, offices for movie making and post-production, competing and complementing studios, the kind of workspaces that want to be in the middle of the city, that are relatively compact, extremely connected, and part of what is, in Oslo called the kind of talent valley, is what they call it. Here, 1 second. See if I can zoom in on there. It's kind of interesting with this. So with this idea of talent brings people together, there's a paradigm that we see now happening because, especially in projects that we have in the West Coast now, as you know, the oil market in Norway is what made the Norwegians kind of phenomenally rich, and then suddenly the prices tripled and oil stopped. There's a radical amount of intelligence engineers, people that have come to Norway that suddenly were looking into new jobs, a lot of them in the building industry, and a lot of that way of working and ideas start to move into the construction industry. We were kind of incredibly, in a certain way, kind of grateful for the crash of oil. Norwegians would never say that because they've lived amazingly well and have stockpiled money to keep them protected for the next 100 years. But what had ultimately started to happen now is, amongst other things, these companies that were outside the city, large headquarters, there's essentially an entire city outside of Stavanger that was built to, let's say, as corporations all within the technology and research around oil, which brought an enormous amount of resources to universities and education and development. At the same time now, what we see is these people starting to move back to the cities. They're willing to leave the business park. The IBMs are willing to leave it in order to move back into the cities. The Statoils on smaller footprints in smaller areas looking to these kind of facilities, and they're willing to pay more money and live on less space, and looking at how they can transform buildings. And this is a kind of transformation that ignited a whole series of transformation in this area, which is ironically enough called the New York. This is the state that we found the building in. A really interesting thing happened. We, as everyone does, went to the planning authorities to kind of look at, what was possible, and they said, well, we only have one requirement. The historical preservationists want you to return the building to exactly the same volume envelope that it was when it was originally built. There's only one problem with that. We actually have no idea what that was. So first you have to prove to us what it was like when it was originally built, and we have no drawings in the archive. And once you've proven that to us, then we'll allow you to build it exactly like that. This is the building from above, under construction, where the burned down part on the left side is rebuilt and lifted. The studios inside and the skylights replaced. A giant technical space kind of dug down next to the river as a kind of boat with, let's say, new plant that would service the entire building. And so what we have is this in section, kind of underground in the building, dark spaces. We've inserted everything that you see yellow in this kind of diagram is daylighting, and essentially as the program moves up in the building, the ground floor, you've got black boxes for cinema. As you move up in the building, you get sound studios for editing film. Moving further up, offices under the skylights, showrooms on the top floor, and on the right side, a large exhibition space for the Office for Contemporary Art. So these are a couple of pictures from that project. This is inside that space here on the left side where you see that staircase. As you move down from the lower floors and the cinemas, moving up to the sound editing, moving up to the offices. One of the cinema spaces, no, one of the sound editing spaces. Moving up through the building. can see one of the things, and in the last project you also see similar treatment here, retracting from all the facades. Let's say we've kind of essentially rebuilt all the facades, rebuilt the finishes, say, as they were originally done, using a kind of old technique, concrete floors. This central space here then becomes the kind of heart in the project where all of the informal meetings are. This is where you enter the building. This is the kind of collective space for all of the offices. Essentially, there's many different film production houses that live in this building and work in this building, and they're all competitive but sharing information at the same time. To find a kind of way for them to work together was incredibly important. How you could build a culture for collaboration of people that actually don't know how or want to collaborate. These are kind of CNC oak walls that you see there, looking towards the entry and the reception desk in front of you. The sound studios, which they're doing Pixar, they're doing Hollywood, so they have these incredible sound booths with insulation from every vibration, vibrations outside, in the floors, inside. The green wall continues through all 3 levels of the building. Here we are, kind of meeting rooms, retracting from the facade, letting light pass through the building, and at the same time kind of protecting the original windows and facades in the building. And you see a number of different ways that we treat and address that. Underneath the skylight, and those thick beams under the skylight, extracting heat and reusing that through the building, cooling in the summertime. Now standing on the top floor in the studios and looking down, back down. And then this is the construction of the underground, which will become the technical space. This space is particularly interesting now. So we finished the building in 2013. It won the prize for, which is really exciting. Not to say that we've won prizes, we have won some. We won the prize for the best building in Oslo. But what's kind of interesting is that it's an adaptive reuse, an old factory building, and the value that the city starts to place on those kind of buildings. Now, 5 years later, we've been asked to redesign the building again, as they want to change all the functions in the building. The gallery is going out, and what we're essentially doing is building a building inside of this building, a kind of freestanding building, using the foundations that we already had in place. So essentially a repurposing of the building that we had intended already when we built it the first time, and kind of created the framework to allow that to happen the second time. So I think that is incredibly important, because a lot of these types of projects become incredibly aesthetic, become interior, let's say, architecture designs, and then that interior either becomes worn and kind of disposed of, or out of date. And in this sense, we were looking more at both, number one, how we could build culture for these guys who are working there, how we could create spaces that will allow them to interact and collaborate. But the second thing was also a kind of robustness in the design that will allow the same owner to use the building in different ways over time. So that's the section of the building as it was originally designed. A large staircase that you see on the left that kind of, in a strange way, took the formality of the gallery and kind of domesticated, and the stair itself became a performance space, the covering for the library, a space for conferences and lectures and presentations, at the same time for exhibitions. So this is how it looked in stage 1 for 5 years ago when we finished the building. A beautiful stair and an enormous amount of white paint, with an incredibly performant underground kind of technical room. This is the stair, Douglas fir, the library underneath the stair, in use for lectures. Kind of an interesting lecture where the lecturer actually stands on the stair and the people sit on the floor, which is not how you normally would imagine it. We imagine people would sit on the stairs and the lecturer would stand on the floor. A music performance, exhibition space, some just detailing. I said I wasn't going to show architecture, but this is actually architecture. This is the new project, which we just started. So this is the first sketch of the building in the building, standing on the foundations of the technical room that we had prepared. A freestanding building that will be offices for film production as well. Okay. Alkebrygge. This project is also in the center of Oslo. It was a kind of fantastic, let's say this is how it looked originally. Here you see oil platforms they were building there. It was a kind of center of technology, boat production, machines for motors for large ships. The building was one enormous space, a brick building. It looked like this inside, which obviously we thought was fantastic and wondering what happened. Well, what happened to it was, in the 80s, as they've done in a lot of cities, and you've probably seen it, they turned this space into, you see the windows in the background, you'll see them again. They turned that space into that space. It's a kind of incredible moment in architecture which I was kind of confronted with, which, and actually the most, let's say, one of the most prolific architects in Norwegian history was responsible for this. He's never spoken to me since we demolished it, which is kind of problematic since he pretty much runs the city, named Niels Torp. The client approached me. It was a client that I had worked with before, and you know, if the last project was about instructions on how to use a building and program a building, this actually looked at how you could turn this building facility back into a kind of urban strategy, and ultimately, you know, 90% of the architecture was all in place. So a kind of daunting project when 90% of the architecture is there, that we actually have to make something that kind of works without using architectural kind of, without making new buildings, new facades, etc., starting with demolition. So it was a shopping mall. The shopping mall was 3 stories high in the middle of the city. In the 80s, it probably worked, but at the point that we were given the project, this is the diagram we got. Green means it's, very simply put, green means it's making money. Red, blue, pink are definitely not making money. They didn't want to give us this information. I kind of insisted. When they gave us this information, step number 1 was, I'm sorry, but you have to get rid of the shopping mall. They said, well, we own all this property, but the only thing we actually know is how to run a shopping mall. And we said that the shopping mall is killing the development. So we started by compressing all the shopping. What we proposed to them to do was we were going to compress 3 levels of shopping onto one plan. And by doing so, we would reduce, by making a more efficient plan, we would reduce their shopping by 30%. And then I'll tell you afterwards what the results of that reduction, were. Step number 1 was to compress it all down. Everything that's red here was demolished. The curved lines you see cutting through is something called the clean cut. It's called the clean cut because we just cut it straight through the building, and structure and everything remains kind of landing in the middle of that space. Everything that you see in red is what started off. So the red hatched areas, everything's demolished. The red lines, everything that will be demolished and built. 3 voids, each of those 3 buildings with its own unique characteristic void, exploiting the voids that were originally there and still there. These are some of the over 100 elements and debris of the unfortunate 80s architecture that we had to demolish. The fake balconies that you see on the right, the bridges that are used to connect the shopping mall so that you can move from one building to the next and still not miss your shopping experience. Balconies that are more or less inaccessible without climbing through the window. Coverings over the door that I'm always kind of fascinated when you make this giant covering over the door and the word says shopping to kind of let you know that that's what you're about to do. So all those things we demolished. A building on the top left was an old beef house, very popular, very contentious to demolish it. but the city historic authorities were relieved that we demolished it. There was a wart that was added to the building. It was a beautiful moment in the 80s. It happens in, I think, a lot of American cities, Baltimore, for example, where you try to imitate this industrial architecture, which generally goes horribly wrong, this kind of imitation. And here was a kind of example of that. So this is how it looked. This is the architecture that we were confronted with. The building on the right, they were generous enough to tell us that we could replace the facade because the facade was underperformant. The building on the left is the building that we focused on in terms of, that was the building that you saw in the first slides showing the old industrial machine hall. The view to the water, the beautiful bridge. The streets are used for service and delivery, so it's constant. But these side streets that you're seeing here, and I think this image is kind of perfect, it's just when we started the commission. There's one remarkable thing, and this is one of the things I thought about. There are 6,000 people that work in this small kind of 6-building block. And as you see on the side streets, there is never a single person on those streets whatsoever. For starters, the buildings are all introverted, so you see that the windows are pretty much blacked out. The shopping mall is obviously looking towards the inside. There are no doors or access along those streets. So all of the side streets, which have names and potentially addresses, are completely empty and devoid of any people. So they're not used. They're not urban. And the theory is essentially that it's Norway, the weather is shit, there's no reason to go outside, there's no reason to actually make streets or public space, etc. We've proven without a shadow of a doubt that urbanity is actually, can make money. It can be a good thing for the clients and can be a good thing for us as well. This is how the project looks today. It's very interesting, about this image right here. After they finished construction, and they approached me and said, well, we really love what you did. They went to a British shopping mall designer who told them one day before construction started that you're making the biggest mistake of your life. Don't believe Space Group. This project's going to be a complete failure. You need to keep the shopping mall. The client took a kind of board meeting and decided that they would stick with our design. But then after they built it, they said, yeah, we like the design. It's still, we think it could be better. What should we do on the side streets? There's still not enough people on the side streets. And we said, well, have you ever thought about putting furniture there? Which is what we had designed. And that same day, because they have their own management and construction company, because it's a large development, they filled the street with furniture, and suddenly everyone who came out of the offices came, sat down, used the furniture. Flower shops started to move out into the streets, and suddenly people understood that that street could be occupied, and suddenly people started to use that space. And yeah, this is how it looks now today. On the left, you have the entrance into the shopping mall. On the right, the large opening is also the entrance into the, you see where people are going in, crossing the street into the shopping mall. There's large openings. What we did, similar to what we did in Nedergata, was also to say that all those openings in the facade, we're going to preserve all those openings. We're going to make voids. We're going to retract the floors. We're going to create, ultimately when you chose us, you're getting less square meters. You're getting rid of all that shopping space. We're cutting voids in the building so you actually can get light in there again. In some areas they have, 8-foot ceilings because they tried to pack so much space into the building as sellable, leasable. And that's the irony, is that in both cases, they probably have about 20%, let's say 15% less office space, not including the second and third floor, which are now office spaces, but 15% less office space. But for the first time in their life, they have 100% of the office space rented out. Before that, they were averaging 70. The commercial space is 30% less, and they have 35% more turnover the first year in the commercial space with 30% less space. So all of that is a kind of factor of a couple of moves that we made. Number one, compressing all that program down into the ground floor. Number two, inverting it, meaning everything that was introverted before became open and extroverted to the streets. All these facades and windows that you saw before, which were closed to the outside, are now open to the outside. So we inverted all the buildings, and we made that clean cut, which dealt with the depth of those buildings, so that people can actually walk through a public street that goes through the entire building. That's the opening on the right side, one of the main entrances. And you can walk all the way through all of these buildings and into the main public square. The waterfront is on the bottom, the internal street on the top. The side streets became landscaped and occupied. And then you have those boxes that you see here. I really should have a pointer. You see these boxes here, which are really simple in this drawing here and here. Those are the inversion of the access for the offices. So the offices also get something we called so the streets became corporate. The offices had addresses. Each of those boxes got a special design. So that's what we designed. And that's what also has kind of added to the value or virtue of having an office that you can actually find your office, and you actually have an entrance to that office now, which before you went into the shopping center and you found an elevator, and that elevator took you inside this labyrinthic building with 8-foot ceiling heights and not any natural daylight or fresh air. So here in one of those openings, going towards the street and towards you see the large opening in the shopping on the other side, crossing the street. Walking inside the clean cut. The same kind of cobblestones that were historically on the outside or on the inside, but polished in different colors, white in the voids reflecting the light, dark colors in the circulation space. So we pulled the facades off. You see the yellow areas where we started then to retract the building from the facades and create double and triple height spaces, both respecting the facades and bringing daylight deeper into the building. Then we started to design the atrium spaces. So we couldn't, the architecture was there. We could design the voids. We could extract parts of the building. We could, let's say, open up the facades to create these kind of conditions. You see the large triple height void space behind the access, behind the entry. To create interior spaces that look like that, which before were offices. Offices that look like this. Then here are the lobbies, as I talked about. And those lobbies then each got a special design, which each gave a kind of address to the offices that were sharing these lobbies above, that look like this. And inside, steel walls using, there was a really interesting discussion that we had with the client when we did design some things, we did make some interiors, and there is the graphic design company, which goes back to my initial statement about our wanting to take more territory and work in more, and to first separate our profession in order to bring it back together. They, of course, branded the building as an industrial building, and industrial has a certain aesthetic with it, which, ironically enough, the argument that we made was, originally you were producing the most advanced motors in Europe inside that building, which are highly precise machines. And so as opposed to this kind of eclectic, industrial, kind of and cluttered effect that they had previously, we started to look at here how that same kind of refinement could use modern day technology. This is using kind of water pressure to kind of create these distortions in these oiled steel plates. All right, just a few images of how that project looks now. And then I want to show you one last 8 more slides of a really beautiful, perfectly academic project, which is going to be realized. This is the entry, Christmas time, obviously. We're not responsible for the lighting. But this was also taken, I think, with my phone. It'll be the first lecture that you've ever seen that's completely done by Samsung. So if we now kind of looked at instructions on how to use the city, instructions on how to use building. And I think this idea of instructions, or this idea of a manual, which we as architects can start to take more territory in. This is our latest project, instructions on how to use the landscape. It's a competition, which we won. Ironically enough, I was the only one in the office that actually had been on the top of this mountain. This is about 2 hours from Oslo, an incredibly beautiful kind of destination, both for free ride skiers and for just general tourist families, people walking. We, let's say as an office, kind of find now, I showed you a project in the Polar Circle. We're doing another project at a place called Svalbard. If you guys don't know it, you should check it out. It's pretty much on the top of the world, a city of 3,000 people, owned by 8 or 10 different countries. It's one of the few places on Earth that has a completely different idea of sovereignty. Most people are there because it's strategically incredibly important, both for research but also for military reasons. It's in the far, far, far north. And we've been asked to design a hotel. It's a really difficult project for us to imagine. Here as well, we're asked to design a hotel. So if you can imagine that small tower there is a communications tower. And a client of ours that we had many years ago with an unsuccessful project has asked us, amongst other things, to put a hotel on the top of that mountain. We refused to do so. We said, you really shouldn't do anything. But what's really fascinating about this mountain, which you don't understand and can't possibly imagine, is that it's actually a military base. Inside the mountain is a kind of labyrinth of tunnels that they were using with communication and satellites and things inside the tunnel, which have now been taken over for touristic purposes. So you can take a small kind of cable car, and most of the people that use it are the skiers who take the car up, which goes inside the mountain. A kind of very steep cable car inside the mountain. You jump out, and then you ski down one of these faces that you see right here. I have not done that. The reason I say it's very academic, because you get these insanely beautiful plans. This is the site plan. That's the entrance to the station. There's an incredibly long cable car that brings you up to the intermediate station. And the intermediate station is a kind of room full of, let's say, was used as a kind of command central. Now is a room used for events, weddings, etc. I have no idea how it actually works, because I can't understand the fire strategy whatsoever. Because if you put 200 people in that room, there's no chance that they can get out in any normal perspective. But the fire strategy is that red line, which is a small, incredibly tiny tunnel and a kind of 2-foot wide stair that goes through the mountain and emerges on the top there. So what you see here is our master plan. It's the most simple master plan that we've kind of ever done. And it consists of 3 lines. This blue line is where you and your kids and your family and your friends go for a walk. It takes you about 3.5 or 4 hours to walk up to the top of the mountain. That's what people do. It's really nice. I've done it. So that's what we call the social route. That social route comes and meets there at a point near the top. The yellow line is actually the cultural route, which in that tunnel, you see between the little black square at the bottom there and the kind of cluster of buildings in the middle is a tunnel which they use or will use, and which we're proposing to use for exhibitions. And then you have that red line, which is the kind of high performance line. Those are the adventurous guys who are skiing. Those black lines are possible trajectories of where you could actually ski, where it's possible to ski. And what I find fascinating then, so if you have the adventurers, the cultural people, and the social people, now you don't understand the section here, but they all intersect at different points. So at some moments you get the social people and the cultural people meeting, There you have a large amphitheater, which they use in the summer, called the Light Festival. Then you have the adventurous people who cross with both the social and the cultural people inside the mountain. That's where we have a bar. Inside that room, which was formerly a military compound. Here we are on the walk up. This is actually the entry at the bottom of the mountain. So what we're going to propose, which they don't realize yet, because, well, the presentation was yesterday. The hotel owner was not present, so he doesn't know, but we're proposing, and there you see the train, which technically does not come outside, but we're bringing it outside. That's the entry to the mountain. There's a small hole, which you can hardly find, and that brings you up to the top. And we're going to tell them if they want a hotel, 24 rooms, only capsules, not hotels, not full service, capsule hotels that'll be at the bottom of the mountain in the valley. And from that point, you can depart on your tour of the mountain. So that's the entire plan, a kind of zoom of the plan. The small dots are all the trails and paths where people are walking, the social path that comes up, the cultural path inside the tunnel. The bar that you see, the bar is the space, is the gray space in the middle. On the top is where you have the TV tower and the apartment for the Sherpa, who actually have built all the paths up there. It's a kind of old concrete bunker that's still there. They still live there, kind of fixing the path each year for people who are walking there. All right, so these are the skiers getting ready. The exhibition space, which at the end will have, this is an existing space as a reference. This is an object in the city before you actually come to the mountain. So we propose different objects to somehow trace. This whole area was militarily known for its heavy water. And so there's a kind of series of facilities that kind of contributed to the Norwegians' minor wartime efforts. The point of that project is this: number one, in a certain way, these kind of three groups of people, and how through a kind of light touch and very kind of, let's say, a way of programming both the overlaps in terms of this infrastructure and how people are moving through this mountain. But essentially, we want people to retain a kind of respectful relationship to nature there. At the same time, we understand that there's a lot of people that are using it. There's a lot of people that are kind of, let's say, abusing it, and how we can create a more interesting and didactic relationship between nature program and users. And I think those are the kind of instructions, and our clients are incredibly supportive of the project, and I think they want to start to realize it immediately. So a small capsule hotel, some installation spaces, repurposing the corridors for exhibition spaces, and a bar in what used to be the kind of military center of the mountain, in the center of the mountain. So, thank you very much.
No, so we were, because we've done a lot of acquisitions, they asked us about it, they asked us to have some ideas for it. It was, we knew about it, and we knew it was there, and but I actually had never, because I've gone there many times, I just never was inside the mountain, and knew the rumors that something existed inside. And it's incredibly, it's, on one end, going inside, it's kind of a bit daunting, let's say. You realize that, you're in the middle of this mountain, and it's a quite rough space. But we, our approach was a kind of light touch, let's say, and how we could get it. I think often as architects, we're looking for a maximum solution to get to maximum impact, which usually becomes a maximum failure in a very short period of time. We're looking more for how preserved but respected. You know, it's kind of yellow listed. They want somehow that history, because it's a fairly kind of clean history, like it was military research and things. So they want that to be preserved. They want to retain the values that are there. You know? So for us, it was a kind of a good starting point in a way. I mean, if it was up to the hotel guy, he would put a casino in the middle of the building. He would drop people with helicopters on the top, and because that's his mindset. That's it. So we didn't let him do that.
I was interested in the political consciousness and engagement of your practice, and I was wondering whether you feel that the sort of political and social sort of culture in Europe has been supporting that, or whether that you could see also existing in the United States.
Well, like I said, first of all, what is the flatness in Scandinavia is incredibly unique, I would say. I mean, social democracy definitely gives you a latitude in a discourse that is not always so easy to find. At the same time, it also has a tendency of exacerbating every discussion endlessly, because everyone has to weigh in. You really can't get anything. I mean, if you look at the projects, it's not unusual, when I say, this project took 15 years, this project took, 10 years in the making, it's still not on site, not broken ground. That's also just because, I have another lecture which is called Slow Cooking, and in a certain way, I kind of embrace the fact that, they're really tough pieces of meat that we're cooking, and they really do need a long time if you want to get a good result. So you really need clients who are kind of patient. But we've also taken a lot more responsibility on our projects kind of economically, and are able to tell our clients, it is possible to do something that's socially responsible, something that's socially intelligent, and to kind of invest in social capital and make money, and here is why, and here's how. And so for us to actually step into that arena and be able to, we do full kind of, economic kind of plans for our clients, and kind of show them the consequences of different choices they make. And that's an arena that we didn't enter into before, so that's a kind of new arena for us. So all these arenas that I talked about that we're stepping into now, I think are helping to kind of redefine the profession, how we work. And that's something that, so that's something that we really want to do, because, I find that the profession in general was becoming more and more specialized, but as such, kind of less and less interesting. We were kind of, becoming increasingly marginalized at our own doing, let's say. So suddenly we were not doing structures, we were not doing landscape, we were not doing interiors, we were not doing business plans, we were not doing branding. We were essentially service providers providing drawings for someone, and even contractors now more and more are asking us for less and less. Like just, contractors at least in Europe, at least in Scandinavia, you can almost start to hand them a sketch design and they say, just let us take over, we'll be responsible for kind of finishing it. And when that moment arrives, then you realize, okay, I'm not saying, because I still think the value of our profession is enormous. I think we enter into another space where we're performing in a different way, and maybe, not just making drawings. In fact, I hope in the future I don't have to make any drawings anymore. I mean, it's incredibly tedious. The risk is enormous. Where we, every new client I've had in the last 2 years, I always say the same thing. We don't want to make drawings for you. We want to be a business partner. If you want us as a business partner, we'll join you. Otherwise, you can find a million other architects that are waiting to do drawings for you. We will do drawings, but it's not the first thing that we want to do, because we want to enter on that. So, and that's what's interesting about these different companies as well. So one of the reasons for making those different companies was to not call them architects. And by doing so, we have one project in Africa where I own 20% of the company, and that gives me, what you said, that puts kind of skin in the game. When you put skin in the game, it's a kind of, you approach it differently. You can go both ways. You could say, okay, now you're just going to become commercial and kind of look at, how to maximize your profits. Fortunately, in my case, it hasn't been an issue, because I pretty much have everything I want. So I don't have to think like that. I'm not looking for boats and cars and things like that. So when I put skin in the game, I put it in there because actually, I want to change the paradigm. In another project, we actually made a project for a client who didn't know we wanted a project. So we actually just saw that this client was interested in a hotel in another market. We went into that kind of market, identified the potential for a hotel, and did that due diligence without him knowing about it. We did it on our own. Then we made a business case for it, made a program for it, found a site for it, and I found 30 sites for it, identified one of those 30 sites, and after we identified one of those 30 sites, we made a sketch just because we wanted to, we didn't need to, and then we went and said, here's a case for you. And he looked at me and said, but you guys are architects. Why the hell would you do all this work? This is, we have other people do this work. And we just said, just read it. Looked at the case, called us a week later and said, it's unbelievable. He said, this is exactly the project, the case, the program, the mix, the location, etc. we want. We said, we've done one other thing. We've identified all the power structure in that city that can help you liberate that site and make that case happen. And we presented that to him. We flew with them over there, met those individuals. And then something really interesting, which we didn't see coming happening. Those guys in the meeting were saying, no, we don't want you to do it there. We'll offer you another site here in this part of the city, and you can build your project. And then, like a normal developer would just say, okay, great, we'll take that. And he said, no, this is where we want to be. And if we have to wait 5 years, we'd rather wait 5 years and have that site with that business case than take that one today. And walked out of the meeting. And now they're waiting. So that's really cool when you can become a partner. So then everyone says, well, then how do you make money off of that? We told them, when you sign that deal, we want 2% of that. If it's in 5 years, then we'll wait 5 years for it. And he said, yeah, because that's a language that they speak. But it's not a language that architects speak. That's just a language. So we said we can wait because, hell, the amount of time we did in that was probably a quarter of what we spend on an actual competition, which we do all the time. And the majority of the competitions, like I said, we have, of all the competitions we've done, we've won 50% of them. We've built, and of those 50%, 2%. So that's another way that we invest capital, let's say. We own also a prefabricated housing company. Someone approached us and said, you make prefabricated housing? We said, we can do it, but we don't want to draw for you. But we'll do it if we can be business partners. And if we can retain all the intellectual property. So we'll do all the work, we'll put all the ideas into it, but we want to keep the intellectual property for ourselves. And that's what we did. And that company now is going to start delivering first. It's for first-time homeowners, kind of low income housing, prefabricated housing. So what is interesting now for me is that every project is a different business model in terms of the contractual understanding that we have. And that means that we're not just going in and saying, okay, here's our hourly rates, and hire us, and we're going to charge you, $100 an hour until the job is done. So each project, and we can do that, but we also want to approach each project as a kind of unique project with a unique understanding and unique contract. And we want to be partners. That's what we want to be. We're kind of tired of being service providers. We want to be business partners. We want to help people, with their business. And I think we as architects sit in an incredible amount of intelligence to do that. But it's incredibly underused. Our educations are ridiculously long and hard and laborious and expensive, and then we use so little of it when we get into the kind of practitioning mode. So that's a paradigm that we're trying to change. More questions? That was good. Sorry it was so long. But, I only get invited once every 15 years. So I have to use the time that I have to, as much as possible. But it's really cool. It's great to be here. I think Milton's doing really, it's an incredible opportunity that's kind of in front of USC, so I'm hoping I can follow it. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you said you're from the States, Delaware?
Yeah, Delaware, it's true.
So how was the process of
It was, I mean, do you want the personal or the?
I guess I can ask you after too.
No, I can tell you. It was very simple. I finished school, went to San Francisco, lived there and worked there for like a year or so. Went back to the East Coast, was totally disenchanted with the profession. I was just completely not interested. I started working in a jazz club. They asked me, do you want to manage the place? Do you want to kind of be a partner in this jazz club? And I realized, okay, this is a kind of moment in life where you can make a choice. I said, no, I just need $500. I'm going to go to Berlin. The wall just came down, and I want to work in Berlin. And not to work in Berlin, I wanted to work for Danny Leibson. So I went to backpack, $500, flew to Berlin, went straight from the airport, right to Danny Leibson's office, stood in the middle of his office, asked for a job. They said no, and I said, I don't understand, I'm going to work here. I came here to work here. I waited for the next person, that was his wife. She said, why are you here? I said, I'm here to work. She goes, okay, show me your stuff. She goes, leave your stuff. She didn't say show me stuff, she said, leave your stuff. I said, no. I'm never, ever, this is like my portfolio. It's hand-printed photographs, I'm not leaving it. She said, no, it'll be fine, leave it. She called me the next morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, and said, yeah, we can come and start working here. Worked there for 1 year, it was a total nightmare. I mean, no disrespect to Daniel, but I totally disrespect the way he works. And then a friend of mine called me from Rotterdam and just said, no, the guy I was living with who has a really beautiful practice now in Switzerland called E2A. Check him out, doing really beautiful work. Really Swiss kind of called E2A. He called me up and he said, you know, there's this guy in Rotterdam named Rem Koolhaas. And I was just into theory and art. And I said, no, that doesn't sound familiar. He said, I think you should go work for him. So I called him up and said, I want to work with you. I didn't say I wanted to work for you. I said I wanted to work with you. And a very big difference. And his secretary wasn't there, so we just picked up the phone. And I said, hey, it's Gary, but I can work with you. Can you come tomorrow? And I was like, okay, I said, sure. And I went there, we interviewed for like 2 hours, and then I started working 2 days later. So I worked there for 6 years, and so that was a kind of not a very slow transition. When you work there, it's kind of 70, 80 hours a week. That's where I met Olivier. I was in charge of a master plan. He was working for Jean Nouvel. I was working for OMA. I had to kind of try to manage those guys who are total tricksters. Jean Nouvel is a total untrustworthy individual who spends most of his time getting his clients intoxicated so he can get exactly what he wants. And it works for him. And we were kind of coming from a kind of Calvinist, Dutch kind of, just honest kind of hard work. And then you go to a meeting in their office and it'd be like, the client arrives at 10, at 10:15, Sean's like, let's go to lunch. By 11 o'clock, they're all wasted. By 1 o'clock, there's no meeting anymore. And so I realized there's 2 totally different ways of doing business. Rem's paranoid critical method and this French, I don't know what you would call it, method. So that's why I met those guys. And so, Rotterdam was a kind of incredibly interesting place to be. And then I left Rotterdam and I went to Norway, in part because for personal reasons, but also to get out of Rem's shadow because I was at OMA at a kind of pretty unique point in history, let's say. By the time I was at OMA, pretty much everyone that you know from OMA was there when I was there at that time. So, Winnie Moss and Jakob and Rice from NDRUV were there, Alejandro Zarapolo and Farsi Wasabi from FOA and other individual offices were there. It was a really good group of people that were there. Bjarke was there. I hired that little fellow. Julien was there. He was just outside. He had to catch a flight. He wanted to come in. I had this idea that we were going to do it kind of like a rap concert where suddenly I would call Julien and he would do a song or two, but he had to leave to the airport. He's building a house here in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica. So Julien Smith from JDS, if you know him, was there. So it was a pretty interesting time. We were 25 people, and now it's, I don't know, now it's probably 500 people, I don't know. So it was a really different office. It was basically, they only built one building at the time I was there. They built I just finished the Rotterdam project at the Kunsthal, and they had a couple small pieces in the house, 2 or 3 buildings. So that was the trajectory. I went to Oslo. What we were doing, bringing the kind of Olé way of working there was completely unheard of. Now everyone's kind of working in that way in Oslo, but at the time there was no one was really thinking along those kind of lines. So we were able to have a pretty interesting niche in the market at that time. So it was a super exciting time to be in Oslo. I mean, it was an insanely naive environment to enter into, which has kind of come a long way now. So, and now we're looking at moving back to the U.S. So part of the reason I accepted the lecture here is because I wanted to be in LA, because we're thinking about opening an office in LA. That is the secret. So, or New York, or LA, or New York, or LA, I'm not sure. One of those things. There's a direct flight from Oslo to LA, so.
Depends on this season.
Yeah, I understood that. So I'm really happy with this season right now. All right. I'll let you guys go. Sorry it was so long. If you have any questions, just come up. Thank you.